Jason Cole, NFL Insider. You can follow him on Twitter at JasonCole62. Joins us on the line now. Get into some of the NFL news and notes as we head into NFL Week 17. Jason, can you believe already 17 is already here?
Well, based on all the non-football news that we dealt with in the first half of the season, yeah, kind of. It just took a long time to get here. But, yeah, we survived Ezekiel Elliott. We survived anthem protests. We finally got to where football matters. So that's been nice.
Before we get into the playoff landscape, I want to ask you about David Gettleman now being hired as the Giants GM. He was already in the Giants organization for over a decade. He went to the Panthers as the GM, and he actually did a good job as the GM of the Panthers. So can you give the audience out there a little insight into the reason why Gettleman was no longer in Carolina and the reason why the Giants settled on him for their GM?
Well, I'll answer the second part first, which is the Giants like to hire people who understand how the Giants like to do business, if that makes sense. In other words, you understand the culture of the team, you understand the goals of the ownership, you understand how, sort of how the team not only wants to win, because everybody wants to win, but also how the team wants to project itself. Because you were talking about a team that's owned by basically royalty of the NFL, the Mara family. They've been in the NFL since the beginning, since the 20s. So they have a style that they want to project. And Steve Tisch, the co-owner of the team, goes along with that. So that's number one. The second part of this is, look, Dave Gettleman did a really good job personnel-wise. I mean, aside from Cam Newton, he picked an awful lot of the players that helped propel that Carolina team to the Super Bowl 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, I should say. So, he has a long and established resume of picking good players, understanding how to build a team. Why he didn't work out in Carolina long term is ultimately Jerry Richardson, who's now out as owner essentially, or is going to be out soon enough. This past offseason, Jerry Richardson wanted to take control of the team more. He wanted to run things himself because he was removing himself from league matters. He wanted to oversee the organization in a much more hands-on approach. So I think this was a personal decision by Richardson to take over the team. The second part of that is, look, Jerry Richardson's sort of the Southern gentleman type, and Dave Gettleman is this New Yorker type. Look, just philosophically, they had their differences, and that we've seen this play out a couple of different times. I think we saw the same thing go on between Joe Banner and Jimmy Haslam in Cleveland. You just get people who they don't know how to communicate necessarily on the same page all the time, and eventually, when you have that kind of relationship, there are hiccups. There are just different ways that people do business, and it doesn't always mix. The fact that it lasted as long as it did, I think, is a credit to Gettleman and the kind of players that he was able to bring in to help the Panthers.
So now Gettleman is in charge of the Giants. What kind of direction do you expect him to go in this offseason? And first, with the next head coach, and also with a roster where, for all intents and purposes, this whole season has basically been a massive eruption.
Well, yeah, but I would say this. Look, that roster's not that bad, okay? Let's go back to the beginning. You lose your best offensive player in Odell Beckham, and then you have Brandon Marshall go down, and even Sterling Shepard is hurt early on. There were a lot of things that went wrong with that roster, okay, that are chance and, bad luck. And on top of that, you had a coach who was in over his head. And Eli Apple imploded as well. But if you look at that roster, you say, okay, you got Janoris Jenkins, and you've got Dominic Rodgers-Cromartie, and you've got Olivier Vernon, you've got Snacks Harrison, and you've got JPP. And on the offensive side, you've got Pugh, and Eric Flowers played better, although he still may not be truly a left tackle, but he's probably a workable offensive lineman in this league. And you've got Odell Beckham. And you see, can Eli get back or not? I think that becomes the critical question. But I don't think this team is that far away from recovering. I mean, this was an 11-win team a year ago. I think that you can flip that pretty fast from where they are now and get back to being competitive faster than you think. A lot of it, however, depends on what's your assessment of the quarterback. As for the coach that Gettleman hires, again, the way that the Giants like to do business is they like to bring in people who have coached there before. And so look at that first. Now, the problem they had when they hired McAdoo is they didn't have a lot of people like that. They didn't understand the philosophy of how the team likes to be run. So you may not have a lot of people, but Steve Spagnuolo has a lot of experience there. I know it might not be the most popular hire, but it might be the most judicious hire if they were to make Spagnuolo the next head coach. I wouldn't be shocked if that happened.
You know, you mentioned that the Giants like to have guys who are already there and understand how to do things, but couldn't I argue that McAdoo, them bringing him back, that kept a problem in that team, which to me, I look at the Giants and I say, there's some discipline issue. There is some culture of guys, just things happening, whether it's Odell Beckham Jr. and his sideline antics, whether it's Eli Apple now suspended for the final week. Couldn't I argue that they need a culture change, and part of that culture change is bringing in a different type of head coach?
Right, but you want somebody who understands the culture of the organization. Look, the culture of the team right now can be fixed. You can get a disciplinarian. You can get a tough guy. That just depends. That depends more on the individual. But you want that individual to have some experience within the Giants organization. Again, somebody who's been around the organization. That's what they did with Parcells. That's what they did with Tom Coughlin. I mean, Tom Coughlin was as much a disciplinary as you could ever possibly find. But he had experience within the Giants organization before he came back. The question is, can you find that person? And if you can't find that person, then you have to go outside of your normal comfort zone. But that's your first priority. Find somebody who understands the culture of the team.
Jason, flipping over to the teams that are going to the playoffs right now, the Eagles clinched home field advantage, but no Carson Wentz. We've seen basically 3 different versions of Nick Foles at this point. How much confidence do you have in the Eagles? Well, you think about it. He came in and he saved the day, got them out of L.A. with a win. Then he threw 4 touchdowns against the Giants.
Well, I think that what you're saying is Nick Foles what he is, which is he's an erratic player. He's had some moments in his career, right? He threw 7 touchdown passes in a game, right, to tie an NFL record. He's also the same guy who went to the Rams and was terrible, right? So, he's an erratic quarterback. The question is, what quarterback do you get any kind of consistency from him for 2 games that gets you to the Super Bowl somehow, right? And I would say that's the hard part to count on. You're going to hope that you face Minnesota in an NFC championship game situation because you'll be playing against a team that's not going to score a lot either. It doesn't have a great quarterback either. So if you hope for that as being one of the games, in the other game, can you survive? All right. So who do you face in the other game? It's going to be probably either New Orleans or the Rams, right?
Right.
So to me, if I'm getting either one of those teams outdoors, pray for the coldest weather game that you possibly can get. Because in both Drew Brees and in Jared Goff, you have 2 quarterbacks who I don't think are going to be very good outdoors. So if I'm an Eagles fan, I'm saying, weather gods, help me out in that first game. And the second game, get me to the Vikings because I'm not afraid. That way, I ask the very least of Nick Foles, and I maximize what I have on defense with that pass rush and with Jim Schwartz and the job that he's done. So I think that, look, just count on the fact that you're not going to want to ask a lot out of Nick Foles because the more you ask, the more you're going to get erratic Nick Foles. If you can avoid that, if you can keep a team to 10 points the way that it did against the Raiders, then you got a chance to get to the Super Bowl. And once you get to the Super Bowl, okay, all bets are off because it's an indoor game. It's going to be perfect conditions. that's going to be a long shot, but you take your chances once you get there.
Jason, before the season, there were a lot of comments about Doug Pederson being a head coach, about how he's not qualified and all this stuff. And now, in his second year, he's already got a team as the #1 seed. Do you think sometimes when it comes to the head coaching position that some of the hyperbole and the crazy words people throw out there, instead of just letting the season play out and seeing what a guy actually does from year 1 to year 2?
Well, you can tell some things about people and their leadership ability and whether they handle pressure and whether they handle tense questions very well. I mean, I've seen that, okay? And I've seen the look in somebody's eyes and say, okay, that guy's going to have problems when it gets really tense in the locker room, right? Mm-hmm. Or it gets tense in the game. So you see, you can feel panic. Okay, but to judge that based on, okay, well, Doug Pederson's too happy-go-lucky and too aw shucks, and, which I feel like, look, Doug Pederson's not your typical Philly guy. Although he's been there for has experience there. He's not your edgy East Coast Philly type of person. Okay, he's a happy-go-lucky guy from Louisiana. That doesn't mean that he's not trained in how to handle things and that he doesn't have really good ideas on how to build a staff that gets a team ready. I mean, this is a guy who had, who understood, go get a defensive coordinator like Jim Schwartz. Okay, go get a bunch of guys who are former players who've been around in the league and understand how to explain things to players. That's, to me, the value of a guy like Doug Pederson. Okay, he built a staff that's one of the most experienced staffs in the league in terms of former players. So to me, there's a lot of positives about Doug Pederson. Although, yeah, does he project the image of Bill Belichick? No, he doesn't project the image of Bill Belichick. Very few guys in this league do. Does he project the image of Mike Tomlin? No, he doesn't. He's his own man. But how does he react in the pressure situations? I think he's reacted pretty well. Again, I covered Doug Pederson when he came in for Scott Mitchell and led the Dolphins to the record-breaking win for Don Shula. He didn't panic in that game. He handled it. Now, he wasn't asked to do a lot in that game, if anybody who remembers that game at the Vet, but he didn't panic, and that was the most important thing about Doug Pederson.
Jason, you mentioned Bill Belichick and Mike Tomlin. The Patriots and the Steelers are the big favorites in the AFC, but you look at teams like the Jaguars. They do good at Pittsburgh and beat the Steelers. Kansas City can score points. And to me, if the Ravens and the Chargers make it in, they're both threats as well. So of the teams that could make it in and face off with the Patriots and Steelers, what teams do you think have the best chance of knocking them out?
Teams that can pass rush. So go to the Jaguars. They can pass rush. Kansas City can pass rush. And even San Diego. Now, I would put San Diego as the best possible team to do it because I think they have the best quarterback. Then I would go to Kansas City with Alex Smith. And then finally, I would have Jacksonville because they have Blake Bortles and I think they have the least experience. That's it. I think it's really close. And one of the reasons I think it's really close is from a coaching standpoint, San Diego has great talent. They have the best quarterback. They have the least experienced coach. And I think that the inexperience of Anthony Lynn has shown up time and again this season. Close loss against Jacksonville, close loss against Denver in the first game, close loss against Miami. Those close games that could have been flipped with better coaching and experience. And I'm not saying he's not going to get there. I'm just saying as a rookie head coach, he wasn't there. But he did guide that team out of an 0-4 start and got them back into contention. So there are some positives and some negatives to Anthony Lynn. The question is, can he go into Pittsburgh or go into New England or try and go into both and pull out a victory? I'd say that's a long shot. All right, so that gets us to Kansas City, Andy Reid. If Andy gets good conditions where, again, Alex Smith is allowed to get some big plays going, Matt Nagy, the offensive coordinator, comes up with some ideas, then I think there's an opportunity there for Kansas City to go in to New England. I don't think they can necessarily beat Pittsburgh because I think it's just a bad matchup strategy-wise for Kansas City. You know, the zone defense that Pittsburgh plays, Alex Smith has a really hard time with. As for Jacksonville, they're the least likely because I just don't trust Blake Bortles. But they do two things that help. They rush the passer and they run the ball. And if you can suppress the score in a game, you know, keep the game into the teens or into the low 20s, I think you have a pretty good chance to win a game, pull one out. I just don't think that you can beat two teams like that. You're going to beat one. You might win one game like that. You're not going to win two.
Jason, the news just came down a little bit ago that the Jets have extended Todd Bowles and Mike Maccagnan. So both of them looks like they'll still be in place, not just next year, but for the future moving forward. So at least that's one coaching opening that probably won't open up. How many coach openings do you think there'll be?
I didn't expect the Jets to open up. I thought that Bowles did. You know, given how they dismantled that team, I thought Todd Bowles did a really good job. You know, the problem is still that they don't have a quarterback, so they've got to figure out the quarterback situation, and a lot of that falls on Maccagnan. But he better get a quarterback this year, or he's done. So the Jets, I never considered one of the teams that was going to be in there. I think there are upwards of 10 teams that could, you know, change their coaches. I mean, we've already, you know, like the Giants, Cincinnati, we know about. Chicago is sitting out there. Houston, we know about. Houston, that could change. Cleveland could change. You know, after you go 1-31, even if ownership wants to keep you, Jackson, I think it's really hard for them to do that. I would say one of the other teams that we're looking at. I mean, there's 10 teams around the league that I think Detroit is certainly there. Tennessee is in the running with this bad finish because both of those teams, both Detroit and Tennessee, I think would be places where Josh McDaniels would be very popular because they're both the general managers are former Patriots executives. I think that both of them would be in a race, but Bob Quinn and John Robinson would be in a race to try and get Josh McDaniels if he'd be willing to leave. So, yeah, I expect there to be a lot of openings this year. Probably more openings than you're going to have qualified candidates, and that's why if it was me, I would be looking at a guy like Mike Shanahan, and I know he's not getting a lot of ink, but I would be looking at a guy like that to come in and run my organization. I would take a really long look at that because I think that, like, if you went and got a guy like Matt Nagy, who's, again, done a nice job here for 2 years as an offensive coordinator, but it might be a stretch bringing him in. He may not be ready yet to run a team, and if you get a guy like that too early, I think you get him before he's ready. I'd rather go get a guy who's been there to straighten out my organization, and then I'll bring in a young guy like that a couple of years afterwards.
Real quick, what about a guy like Jim Schwartz?
Oh, I think Jim Schwartz deserves another shot. I mean, you know, people are talking about, you know, Jeff Fisher's name gets out there, and part of that's because Jeff is pushing his own name out there. But there are a lot of people who talk about, oh, Jeff Fisher, you know, has done a lot. Okay, Jeff Fisher's career is sometimes a little bit underrated and sometimes a little overrated, depending on who you're talking to. It's accomplished. But to me, you've got a guy like, again, we talked about Steve Spagnuolo, we talked about Jim Schwartz, talk about Mike Smith. Those guys have had some pretty good success at times in their first jobs, and moments where you said, okay, we're starting to come together, and then it fell apart. And you say, okay, why did that happen? Can they fix it? To me, I would look at those guys before I would look at Jeff Fisher, because part of me thinks Jeff Fisher is kind of burned out. I think his desire and love and push to be great is not where those guys like Schwartz and Mike Smith and Steve Spagnuolo is right now. I think those guys are really hungry for that next chance, and I think sometimes Jeff Fisher just wants to be a head coach to say he's been a head coach.
He is Jason Cole. You can follow him on Twitter at JasonCole62, NFL Insider. Jason, appreciate the time today. I hope you have a happy new year.
No problem. Take care. Thanks.